We speak to independent analyst Khaya Sithole. Khaya, good afternoon and thank you for joining us. I mean, we've seen that questions have been raised on the amount of this deal, many even arguing that it's not possible to cost the deal unless you've done some due diligence. Do you think this argument holds any water?
Good evening and good evening to the viewers. Yes, and I think what we have come to realize over the past 24 hours is that it clearly isn't as straightforward a deal as we were led to believe in the morning press conference of yesterday. So obviously the most important thing is that any investor that wants to take part in this deal, particularly because it doesn't involve just SAA, but also its subsidiaries, needs to be able to do the type of due diligence work that enables them to make a call on whether they want to invest and how much they want to invest. So originally, when the conversation started, it sounded like it was a done deal. But from what we are seeing now, it clearly is simply a statement that says, of all the prospective bidders that we've looked at, this is the one that we're going to go with. And these are the ones that have already said that they have 3 billion rand available in working capital, but that is all subject to them looking at exactly what it is that we're offering as the state and then deciding whether they're interested in it. And if they are interested in it, we will sell them at least 51% of the state airline.
Khaya, let's shine a spotlight on the directors. I mean, some of them have been at the Commission of Inquiry of the PIC, in fact, also accused of wrongdoing. I mean, is this not going to damage or dent the image of the deal?
No, I think unfortunately a deal of this nature, it requires a lot more to dent it, because my suspicion is that whoever emerges as a prospective bidder on a process that has been so cloaked in secrecy is always going to be subject to questions of why you, what is it that you offer the state that actually put you in the front line ahead of other bidders. So that's, for me, the bigger problem, in that we are still having to figure out how the deal came to be. And the reality here is that we are still dealing with the state asset, we're still dealing with state resources. So it shouldn't be open to the Minister of Public Enterprises to simply say, well, in any other deal, our deliberations are secret and we only ever talk about what the final deal is. The public, in this case, is entitled to know exactly what it is that the state of the airline looks like, and then make the call of, well, actually, if that's the state of the airline and this is the deal that is being put on the table, we do agree, because Pravin Gordhan is not selling his own family jewels, he's actually selling the country's family jewels.
Well, Khaya, let's wrap this conversation perhaps by just taking a look at the timing of this deal. I mean, it comes at a time where we're jostling, or members are jostling for positions for the upcoming ANC leadership election, which is obviously happening next year. My question to you is this not going to lead to Ramaphosa detractors? I mean, particularly with the RET forces, are they going to use this to fight back?
According to official ANC protocol, we're not supposed to recognize anything called the RET forces. They like to pretend that such a thing doesn't exist. But for me, Lizal, actually, even before we get to the ANC elective conference of 2022, for me, this was more about the optics of this weekend at the G7 summit, because Ramaphosa was invited there by the G7 to simply say, come in your capacity as the big leader of the African continent. And one of the big talking points is always the question of, well, you've been going on an investment drive, and people have said that some of the problems that they have is that your state-owned enterprises are a drain on the fiscus and you insist on holding on to them. So the conversation around Eskom on Thursday and conversation around SAA on Friday are the type of conversations that amount to good PR capital for him when he's sitting in the room with people that are clearly as pro-capitalist as all the leaders of the G7 are. So I think the immediate political PR was all about that. The longer-term question of whether he has now gone beyond what the ANC expects or what the ANC has said needs to be done about state enterprises is a massive risk. And I think, obviously, if there is this question to be raised next year on why is it that an organization that believes in controlling so much of the economy is now selling off state assets bit by bit, it's going to be a very difficult conversation for him to deal with, but it depends on who is on the other side of the conversation and how they can convince the delegates that actually this is the way to go or not the way to go. But it may just be too late, because once we're done with SAA, once we're done with Eskom, it's a matter of who's next.
All right, well, we'll wait with bated breath, of course, to see the outcomes of the G7 summit. President Ramaphosa's influence, particularly during those bilateral talks. Khaya Sithole, we're going to leave the conversation there. Thank you very much for joining us. Perhaps moving on to SAFTU General Secretary, Mr. Zwelinzima Vavi, to also get reactions from them on this front. Now, Mr. Vavi, a very good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us. I think the big question on your end is that some of the directors arguably have political background and are still wielding strong influence within the ANC alliance. Now, the question is this not going to lead to suspicions that there was any political influence?
Good evening, and thank you very much for inviting us. Well, we care about the Javelin syndrome that has been playing itself out for the past 27 years of democracy, where leaders of government of yesterday suddenly resigned to join the other side in the private sector. Before you know it, there's a restructuring inside the public sector in institutions that they need to lead. And on the other side, it is they who would have started the ball running inside the government. This is not just the only isolated issue as it relates to SAA today, but it also relates to ESCOM. If you look at ESCOM and you look at the scale of the conflict of interest of the ANC by its companies that are in business, who are suddenly big beneficiaries in all of these massive inflated prices that we pay at these supposed solutions to ESCOM crisis, you will see that we are being taken for a ride as a country. Nothing happens in South Africa without somebody in the ANC standing to benefit somewhere down the line.
All right, so on that point, Mr. Vavi, the ANC Alliance has been fighting privatization of state-owned entities. I mean, who can forget the heated tension between former President Thabo Mbeki and alliance partners, both COSATU and the SACP, during the introduction of gear policy? The question is, are we not seeing history repeating itself where state-owned entities are being privatized? Or is this restructuring, as the President alludes to?
Well, if you look at this history, it started way back in 1995 when the former president, or the founding father of South Africa's democracy, Nelson Mandela, coming from a divorce meeting in Switzerland, came back to announce that the privatization is now the fundamental ANC policy. He said this without any discussion. Before we know it, the then deputy president of the country, President Thabo Mbeki, announced that there's going to be privatization, restructuring, acquiring of strategic partnerships. And at that time, COSATU was pretty strong. So we threatened to go to the streets, and that we forced a reversal of that blanket privatization. And a National Economic Forum was created, and there was some discussion. There was a framework that developed. Yes, we couldn't stop all of the privatization from happening. For example, Telkom was privatized partially. The bus companies, however, were wholly privatized, and there was commercialization of all of the state-owned enterprises. Job losses became the order of the day in all of them. But we have stopped it partially at that time. But privatization has now come back full-blown under the leadership of President Ramaphosa. And they're following the same strategy. And the strategy is, and I want to quote Naum Chomi, one of the American leading intellectuals, who says, and I quote him, that's the standard of technique of privatization. Defund, make it suffer, things don't work out, people get angry, you then hand it over to the private capital. It's a typical technique that has been used in the case of SAA. SAA was a leading airliner in the whole world. It was voted #1 by every airliner in the world. It was the best. In the past 25 years or so, it has been driven down to ashes. And so suddenly, instead of the excellency in service, it became absolutely bad. In terms of reliability, it became one of the worst, and that you avoid when you have important meetings on the other side. Instead of being the cheapest, it became one of the most expensive. And before we know it, everybody was saying we cannot afford the bailouts, so we must sell these things out. And they are now being sold to people who would have started this whole restructuring discussion whilst they were still in government. And we worried about that technique. And the same thing is happening into Dinel, in PRASA, in ESCOM. We think that before the next 5 years or so, ESCOM will be sold because it is now on its knees. Dinel may be sold. PRASA, they are already cutting chunks of it and giving it to the private sector, and the list goes on.
Oh, Mr. Vavi, I mean, let's look at where to from here. We're likely to see the workers' federations, both COSATU and SAFTU, winning the battle of fighting for state-owned entities. For SAA, where to from here?
Written a letter to COSATU Fetusa and NACTU 2 weeks ago, where we were saying to them, unless the three federations can work with all of these unaffiliated trade unions, and unless all of the trade union movement can hold hands with the citizens of Soweto who are battling against blanket electricity cut-offs and or service delivery or lack of water in public hospitals, you can name all of the list. Unless we can combine and coordinate all of the current disputes, which are about launching a massive attack on workers, wage freeze left, right, and center, and way below inflation increases, and attacks on the gains that have been scored by workers over many, many years. Unless we can coordinate a single dispute and go on a strike in a coordinated way, the austerity programs that have seen nurses' burdens in the hospitals increasing because the government will not fill the vacancies, or will not employ, or will not invest in the infrastructure, and the teachers' burden is increasing because the 85% of our schools have no laboratories, have no libraries, and unless we can do that, we will see a burden increasing on the shoulders of each and every police officials, as Khaya Sithole tells us, that we have a 60,000 vacancies in the police service. If we were to have those numbers, we'll be able to fight crime levels better. So we need to understand, as the trade union movement, that this is not a battle that the trade unions can fight and win on its own. This is the battle of the working class, where all of those who are under the attack from neoliberalism and austerity will be able to join hands and fight against privatization of SAA, privatization of ESCOM, and the collapsing of Dinel, and so forth and so forth.
Well, some strong sentiments coming through from SAFTU General Secretary Zwelinzima Vavi. We'll leave that conversation there. Of course, just reacting to the latest SAA deal, some arguing that it raises more questions than answers. We'll continue with that coverage as it unfolds.